Hello, welcome to the recap of the game between Richard Rapport and Jorden van Foreest in the round 2 of Tata Steel. This was a really dry game, really equal game. Let's get to it. We had the Slav defense after c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, and now knight bd2, which is not so often played, but the idea is to play for e3, bishop d3, and to recapture after some potential dc4 to recapture with the knight, not to lose time for the bishop recapture. Van Foreest answered with bishop f5, which is a very natural move, getting out the bishop from c8, and now knight h4. He wants to challenge the bishop and to bring it back to some of these three squares. Van Foreest chose bishop e6, targeting c4, and Rapport now chose to develop by e3, opening up the bishop and also defending on c4. Now black plays g6 because bishop on e6 is hindering the e pawn, so bishop has to fianchetto, and now b3. The bishop has to go to b2 now, bishop g7, bishop b2, and now castles. Now white goes rook c1, and now black plays knight e4, a really smart decision, I would say. Now capturing on e4 is not good because after d4 the knight is stranded on h4 and g5 is a strong threat. So he goes back to f3, which is more logical, just bringing back the knight, which is very useless on h4. It doesn't do anything. And now queen a5. Black is trying to pin the knight on d2. a3, going for b4 next. And now c5, using the pin on the long diagonal. White just finishes development with bishop d3. And now black took, queen d2, queen takes, king takes, and now knight d7. Still, there is some tension in the center. Neither sides wants to capture really, because first of all, white cannot capture on c5 because the bishop on b2 hangs. If he takes on d5 in this position, there's b3 weakness, which might be too annoying to handle. Also, the king on d2 is a potential target for black rook on d8. When it comes to d8, some pin might cause some weaknesses in the position, so white still has to put his king into the safety. He waits for this and he plays rook c2. First of all, defending the bishop on b2 and also preparing to double on the c file. Black played rook a d8 and now h3. h3 is played mainly because white wants to get his king to e2 and not allow bishop g4, which would weaken d4 additionally. After capturing on f3, the d4 would be very soft. Here, black played rook fe8, although it was better to go for dc, to break tension in the center, using the fact that the king is still on d2. And now it's not as good to do this, because after capturing there is e5, putting pressure on d4. It's not possible now to capture on c5, since knight b6 wins the exchange. So after dc, in this position, bc is possible, and white has some weaknesses, these hanging pawns in the center. After this, probably it's best to capture with the bishop. If he captures with the pawn, both pawns are becoming weak, so maybe it's best to just keep only one pawn weak by bishop d4, but still, after b6, I think that black has good chances. So this was the chance to make the life more complicated for white, but he went for rook fe8 in this position, and now white used the chance to get his king to e2. Now black took on d4, but bishop d4, and now we get massive exchanges. dc4, bishop c4, takes, bishop d4, knight d4. And now the issue with black's position is that white controls the c file. The potential control of the d file wouldn't be so useful to black, since king is covering all the entry squares, and white can use only one rook to cover a potential d1 entry square. I think that the main factor is that white's king is in the center on e2, covering really nicely these entry squares, and the c file is not under black's control. He goes knight b6, and now rook c5. I think that here it was better to go for rook c7, because it's not good for black to go rook d7, since after this, rook c1, now black cannot stop rook c7 and the position becomes really unpleasant. But there is a chance for black to generate some counterplay, and I think that's something that Rapport didn't like in this position. The way to do so is to give up the pawn on b7 by knight d5, and after rook b7 to go e5 with knight c3 next. And after knight c6, let's say, there's knight c3. And after king f3, because if it goes to the first rank, there is a checkmate on d1. So king f3 is the only move. And now after rook d6, rook f6, the game becomes really complex. White will eventually lose his f2 pawn. And let's say if knight a7, rook f6, king g3, knight e4, he's losing the f2 pawn. Yes, white has two passed pawns, but also black can generate some counterplay via d8, d2, target g2, maybe push pawns to f4, why not, and create some tough decisions for white. Maybe white wanted to have more control in the game and he played rook c5. He played slower. Now after rook c8, black manages to exchange rooks. White tries to control the c file, but after a couple of exchanges, now white is forced to take knight c8 and now king d3. White has an advantage because his king is more active at the moment. The only issue is to bring the king closer to the center. Knight d6. Now he tries with f4. He was trying to stop e5. And now f5. Black played f5 because he wanted to stop e4, e5, expanding in the center and pushing the knight on a more passive square. Now we have some kind of fortress with the knight on d4. King cannot advance anymore, so knight goes away. King f7 and now a4. Expanding on the queen side with a4, also somehow limiting the knight from d6. But he still has knight e4, king d4, king e6, and now g4. One more expanding move, but this time it's on the king side. King d6, and now b4. Knight goes back to f6, and now he took, and knight g5. Now black cannot play h6 because of the fork on f7 and capturing on h6, but now Foreest plays e6. This was the critical moment in which Rapport plays e4. And now the point is that after some potential pawn ending with knight e4 takes is lost. After b6, let's say white tries to spend tempi and not to allow king to get to e5, white can play b5 and after king eventually getting to d7 to go to e5, and finally he gets f5. Let's say king f7, king e5, king e7, and now h4. And now if king goes to f7, then the king enters to the queen side, captures the a7 pawn and wins the game. If the king steps away to d7, then he takes the h pawn and it's also over. If black plays h6, there's also h5, and now we again have a Zugzwang. If king goes to f7, then you can even go king f5. That's even more precise. And after king g7, you go to e6, and eventually you capture on h6, use the h pawn as a decoy, and capture those pawns on the queen side. So after e4, Foreest played knight d7, which was a huge mistake, decisive mistake, losing the h7 pawn. It was the best to go for fe, and after knight e4 to go king e7, not to capture on e4, like we saw before. This would just transpose to the previous line. So after knight e4, king e7 would still hold the game, since the pawn endgame is just a draw. Because now the difference is that, let's say if king e4, then b6, b5, and now h6. And now white can play h4, but after h5, he has to go back, which leads to king f5, king f3, and now pushing e5. We have the opposition, and it's a dead draw. White will just follow black wherever he goes, and it's a draw. But instead, in the game, knight d7 was played, and now Rapport just took on h7. Foreest tried to liquidate some material with e5, but he took a pawn on f5 now. He was hoping that those two weak pawns would get under control, but it was not so easy to manage them. After king c4, king e5 was played, now f6. Now the problem is that every pawn endgame is lost for black, because there is also h pawn and the king is just going to collect these pawns on the queen side. king e6, and now b5. Knight e5, king d4, and now a6. Black wants to liquidate as many pawns as possible, so he can reach some potential endgame in which there's only knight versus king. But that's not going to happen. White gave a check on g5, king took on f6, but there is knight e4, and after this, knight d6. Now he tried to get closer to the h-pawn with king f4, but after b6, keeps both pawns in the game, and even if black somehow manages to get the h-pawn, white still has two pawns and the knight versus knight. And here Van Foreest tried a5, but after king c5, he simply resigned because in the next couple of moves he's going to lose b7 and a5, and the king is just too far away. He needs two tempi to capture h3, so those two pawns will just promote. You saw how seemingly drawish position turned into a nightmare for black after this move, after e4, which was kind of tricky. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon. Bye.